What if everything you learned about World War II missed the most important part of the story? Most people think the war started when Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939. But that is like saying the Titanic sank because it hit ice. Sure, that is what happened on the surface. But what if the real cause was something completely different? What if I told you that World War II was actually a debt collection operation that had been 20 years in the making? What if I told you that Hitler's rise to power was financially engineered by the exact same American banks that had profited from the First World War? This sounds insane, right? It sounds like rewriting history. But the ledger doesn't lie. The story doesn't begin in 1939. It begins in 1919 at the Palace of Versailles. This is where the winners of World War I decided to punish Germany. They forced Germany to sign Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. This wasn't just an apology, it was a bill. The Allies demanded 132 billion gold marks in reparations. In today's money, that is roughly $400 billion. It was a number so large that everyone in the room knew Germany could never pay it. And that was the point. It wasn't designed to be paid. It was designed to create a permanent debt extraction mechanism. But here is the part your history teacher skipped. Germany didn't have the money. So how did they pay Britain and France for 5 years? They borrowed it. And who did they borrow it from? American banks. The entire system was a circular Ponzi scheme designed on Wall Street. Germany would borrow millions from JP Morgan and American investors. They would use that money to pay reparations to Britain and France. And then Britain and France would use that money to pay back their war debts to the United States. American banks were essentially lending money to Germany so it could flow through Europe and come right back to New York, collecting interest at every single stop. It was the perfect circular debt trap. I know this changes how you see the good guys and bad guys, but you need to understand that for the bankers, there were no sides. There were only debtors. The Dawes Plan of 1924 made this official. They actually installed American financial overseers inside the German government to make sure the tax revenue went to the banks before it went to the German people. Germany wasn't a sovereign nation anymore. It was a foreclosure project. And this worked great for the banks, until the money stopped flowing in 1929. Because when the American stock market crashed, the loans to Germany stopped. And when the loans stopped, the reparations stopped. And when the reparations stopped, the entire global financial system began to collapse. This was the moment the bankers needed a strongman to ensure they got paid. And they found one. Now, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a Wall Street banker in 1930. The stock market has just crashed. The circular debt machine we just talked about, the one where you lend money to Germany so they can pay France, so France can pay you, has stopped spinning. The music has stopped, and Germany is broke. Unemployment in Berlin explodes from 1 million to 6 million in just 3 years. The German economy is teetering on the edge of total collapse. If Germany collapses, they default on billions of dollars in loans. If they default, you, the American bank, go insolvent. You are facing a catastrophe. You need Germany to be stable enough to pay its debts, but not so strong that it challenges you. You need order, and you don't care how you get it. This is the moment history changes. This is where the standard narrative says, Hitler rose to power because he was a charismatic speaker. Rubbish. You can be the best speaker in the world, but you can't take over a major industrial nation without capital. In 1930, the Nazi Party was a fringe group of extremists. By 1933, Hitler was chancellor. How did they pay for the rallies? How did they pay for the uniforms, the propaganda, the travel? The money came from German industrial giants, companies like IG Farben, chemicals, Krupp, steel, and Thyssen, coal. But here's the question nobody asks. Where did these German companies get the money in the middle of a Great Depression? They got it from you, the American financial system. Even while the rest of the world was starving, American investment kept flowing into specific German sectors. Why? Because the bankers made a cold calculation. They looked at Germany and saw two options. Option A was communism, which meant seizing the banks and defaulting on all debts. Option B was fascism, which meant crushing the labor unions, privatizing industry, and, most importantly, promising to honor international debts. For Wall Street, Hitler wasn't a monster yet. He was a debt collector. He was the CEO of a restructuring plan. This isn't just speculation. We know about the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. This was an institution created in 1930 in Basel, Switzerland, specifically to manage these reparation payments. It was the central bank for central banks. Its board included American, British, and German bankers. And here is the dark truth. The BIS kept operating throughout the entire rise of Hitler, channeling money and gold between the Allied nations and Nazi Germany, essentially keeping the financial lifeline open. The bankers were sitting at the same table in Switzerland, while the politicians were preparing for war. I know this is heavy. It's hard to accept that the good guys might have funded the bad guys for profit. But we have to look at the receipts. And we are building a community here that isn't afraid of the receipts. We are currently racing to hit 1,000 subscribers by December 31st, 2025. If we hit that goal, I'm going to release the killer video, the one that exposes the modern version of this, showing how elites rig the system today. I am taking a risk by even talking about this, but I will drop the full video if we hit the goal. So hit that subscribe button if you want the truth. Now, let's look at the specific American corporations that didn't just lend money, but actually built the Nazi war machine. The standard history books tell you that Hitler rebuilt the German military through the sheer force of will and German engineering. That is a lie. Germany was bankrupt. Their industrial base was gutted by World War I. You cannot build tanks, planes, and synthetic fuel out of thin air. You need capital, you need technology, and you need patents. And who provided them? The titans of American industry. This wasn't accidental trade. This was deep strategic partnership. Take IBM, for example. The Holocaust wasn't just a massacre. It was a logistical challenge. To round up millions of people across a continent, you need a massive database. In the 1930s, computers didn't exist, but IBM's Hollerith punch card machines did. IBM, through its German subsidiary, leased these machines to the Nazi regime. They provided the technology that allowed Hitler to organize the census, identify Jewish citizens, and manage the concentration camps. IBM's president, Thomas Watson, even received a medal from Hitler in 1937. They didn't just sell the machines, they serviced them throughout the war. Then look at the military hardware. General Motors and Ford were the engine of the Blitzkrieg. GM owned Opel, one of Germany's largest car manufacturers. By 1938, the Opel factory in Brandenburg was producing the trucks that the German army would use to invade Poland. Ford's German subsidiary was doing the exact same thing. American executives in Detroit were fully aware that their German factories were tooling up for war. Yet the production lines kept moving. And finally, the most critical resource of all, fuel. Germany has no oil. You cannot run a modern air force without high-octane fuel and synthetic rubber for tires. Who solved this problem? Standard Oil, controlled by the Rockefeller family. They entered into a massive cartel agreement with IG Farben, the German chemical giant. Standard Oil shared critical patents for synthetic rubber and fuel technology with the Nazis. Technology that kept the Luftwaffe flying when they should have been grounded. But perhaps the most shocking connection leads directly to the American presidency. Prescott Bush, the father of President George H.W. Bush and grandfather of George W. Bush, was a director at the Union Banking Corporation. In 1942, the U.S. government seized the bank's assets under the Trading with the Enemy Act because it was acting as a financial front for Fritz Thyssen, the man who funded Hitler's rise. Think about that. The family dynasty that produced two American presidents made its initial fortune managing the accounts of the Nazi war machine. These weren't rogue actors. They were the establishment. And they were keeping the ledger balanced while the world prepared to burn. If you think the collaboration ended with corporations selling trucks and fuel, you are missing the most critical piece of the puzzle. You need to know how the money actually moved. In a war, how does Germany pay for Swedish steel or Portuguese tungsten if their currency is worthless? They need a clearinghouse. And in 1930, the global bankers built one specifically for this purpose. It was called the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, headquartered in Basel, Switzerland. The official story was that the BIS was created to manage the reparation payments from World War I. But in reality, it became the central bank for central banks, an institution that operated above national laws and beyond the reach of any government. Here is the fact that should make your blood run cold. Throughout World War II, while American soldiers were dying on the beaches of Normandy and German soldiers were freezing in Russia, the board of directors of the BIS continued to meet in Switzerland. American bankers, British bankers, and Nazi bankers sat at the same table, smoked cigars, and balanced the ledger. The BIS was the financial lung of the Nazi war machine. When the Nazis looted gold from the central banks of occupied Europe, and even the gold teeth and wedding rings from Holocaust victims, they couldn't spend it directly. It was blood gold. So they sent it to the BIS in Switzerland. The BIS then washed it, converting the stolen gold into Swiss francs or other currencies that Germany could use to buy raw materials on the international market. Without this mechanism, the German war effort would have collapsed economically years earlier. And what happened to the American president of the BIS, Thomas McKittrick? Was he arrested for trading with the enemy? No. After the war, he was celebrated. The institution was deemed too big to fail and too important to disrupt. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted the generals and the politicians, but they barely touched the bankers. This proves the ultimate truth of the conflict. The soldiers were fighting a war of ideology, but the institutions were fighting a war of ledgers. They ensured that no matter which flag flew over Berlin, the debts would be honored and the currency would flow. But the debt collection didn't stop with the destruction of Germany. The biggest financial victory of the war wasn't the defeat of Hitler, it was the enslavement of the Allies. While the US military was fighting to liberate Europe, the US financial system was fighting to foreclose on it. We often think of the alliance between America and Britain as a special relationship based on friendship. But in the world of finance, there are no friends. There are only creditors and debtors. Before World War I, Britain was the world's banker. By the middle of World War II, Britain was broke. To survive the Nazi onslaught, they needed American supplies, food, oil, ammunition, and America provided them, for a price. This was the Lend-Lease program. It sounds generous, like lending a neighbor a garden hose, but in reality, it was a massive transfer of wealth. The United States shipped $50 billion worth of supplies, about $700 billion today, to the Allies. But in exchange, the US demanded that Britain strip itself of its imperial assets. Britain had to sell off its investments in America, hand over its gold reserves, and even trade its naval bases in the Caribbean for old destroyers. By the end of the war, the British Empire was financially hollowed out, owing a debt to the United States that it wouldn't finish paying off until 2006. Think about that. The British taxpayers were paying for World War II for 60 years after Hitler died. This was the geopolitical masterstroke. The war destroyed Germany militarily, but it destroyed Britain financially. It cleared the board of all competitors. America emerged from the rubble holding 80% of the world's gold reserves and holding the IOUs of every major nation on Earth. This brings us to a question of justice that history books ignore. We prosecuted soldiers for following orders, We prosecuted politicians for making orders. But do you think the bankers who funded both sides, the ones who profited from the destruction of their own allies, should have been prosecuted too? Go to the comments and type yes or no. I want to see if you think the just following business excuse is any better than just following orders. Because the system they built after the war wasn't designed to prevent conflict. It was designed to ensure the debt never stopped flowing. If you want to pinpoint the exact moment the United States conquered the world, do not look at Hiroshima in 1945. Look at New Hampshire in July 1944. While the war was still raging in Europe and the Pacific, 730 delegates from 44 allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel for the Bretton Woods Conference. The stated goal was to rebuild the global economy and prevent another Great Depression. The actual goal was to formalize the transfer of imperial power from London to Washington. At this conference, two titans squared off in a battle that would determine the financial fate of every human being on Earth for the next century. In one corner was John Maynard Keynes, representing the British Empire. Keynes knew that Britain was bankrupt, and he feared a world dominated by American debt. So he proposed a radical idea: a neutral international currency called the Bancor. The Bancor would be used for global trade, ensuring that no single country could weaponize its currency against others. It was a system designed for balance, fairness, and stability. In the other corner was Harry Dexter White, representing the United States. White didn't want fairness. He wanted dominance. He knew the US held 80% of the world's gold and was the only industrial power left standing. So he crushed Keynes's proposal. The American plan was simple. The US dollar would be the world's reserve currency. The dollar would be backed by gold at $35 an ounce, and every other currency on Earth, the pound, the franc, the yen, would be pegged to the dollar. This seemingly boring technical detail was actually the greatest geopolitical heist in history. By forcing the world to trade in dollars, the United States gained the exorbitant privilege. America could simply print paper money to buy real goods. French wine, Saudi oil, Japanese electronics, while every other nation had to work to earn those dollars. It allowed the US to export its inflation to the rest of the world and run massive deficits without consequence. The IMF and the World Bank were created at the same meeting, ostensibly to help poor nations, but in reality to act as the debt enforcers of this new dollar empire, ensuring that countries followed American economic rules if they wanted access to capital. But the Americans had learned a crucial lesson from the disaster of World War I. At Versailles in 1919, they had crushed Germany with unpayable debts, which led to Hitler. In 1945, they realized that a dead debtor cannot pay interest. So instead of crushing West Germany and Japan, they rebuilt them. This was the Marshall Plan. The US loaned $13 billion to rebuild Western Europe. History books call this generosity. A banker calls it vendor financing. The Marshall Plan money came with strict strings attached. European nations had to use the funds to buy American goods, transported on American ships. They had to lower their tariffs and open their markets to American corporations. It wasn't charity. It was an investment in creating a permanent customer base. By rebuilding Germany and Japan, the US created thriving economies that were chemically dependent on the US dollar and American debt. They integrated the former enemies into the system, turning military rivals into economic satellites. This was the ultimate victory. The British Empire was dismantled not by German rockets, but by American accountants. The German Reich was defeated not just by tanks, but by the sheer industrial capacity of American capitalism. And when the smoke cleared, the United States didn't need to colonize land like the old empires. It had colonized the money itself. Every trade, every loan, and every central bank reserve was now anchored to the Federal Reserve. The war had successfully transitioned the world from a system of colonial conquest to a system of financial extraction. And unlike military occupation, which breeds resistance, financial occupation is invisible. The victim doesn't realize they are conquered. They just worry about their credit rating. The pattern established at Versailles in 1919 and perfected at Bretton Woods in 1944 is still operating today. We are taught that the Cold War was an ideological battle between capitalism and communism. That is the cover story. The financial reality is that the Soviet Union represented an alternative economic system that refused to use the US dollar and refused to join the IMF. The entire Cold War was an arms race designed to force the Soviets to borrow money they didn't have to build weapons they couldn't afford. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, it wasn't conquered on the battlefield. It went bankrupt. It defaulted. The dollar system won again. Look around you today. The institutions that financed Hitler, J.P. Morgan, Chase, the Bank for International Settlements, are still here. They are larger and more powerful than they were in 1939. The debt trap model hasn't been retired. It has been globalized. When a country goes to war today, whether in the Middle East or Eastern Europe, the result is always the same. Massive debt, reconstruction contracts for American corporations, and a tighter integration into the dollar system. History is clear. Wars create debt. Debt creates control, and control creates profit. The bankers who triggered World War II collected their debts through 50 million deaths, and they are still collecting interest on their victory today. The war didn't end. It just moved from the battlefield to the balance sheet. This brings us back to our mission. We are digging up the truth that they buried. And we have a goal. We are racing to hit 1,000 subscribers by December 31st, 2025. If we hit that number, I am going to release the killer video. This is the script I have already written that exposes the modern mechanisms the elites use to rig the stock market and front-run the next crisis. I am genuinely afraid to upload it because it attacks the people who own the platforms. But if we hit 1,000 insiders, I will take the risk. Before I go, I want to talk to you directly, just you and me. I know this is a dark story. Realizing that the most devastating war in human history was essentially a business transaction for the banking elite can make you feel cynical. It can make you feel like the world is evil and there is nothing you can do about it. But I see it differently. They relied on secrecy. They relied on the fact that for 80 years, nobody looked at the ledger. They counted on us believing the Disney version of history. But you are watching this video. You are looking at the receipts. That means their camouflage is failing. When you understand how the game is played, you stop being a pawn. You start seeing the world clearly. That is why I am building this channel. Not to spread doom, but to spread awareness. Because an awake population is the only thing that scares a banker. We are going to uncover every lie they told, one video at a time. So, if you are with me, hit that subscribe button. Let's build something they can't ignore. Class dismissed.